So chapter 22 is continuing these couple of chapters. The Alter Rebbe is building a very slow but steady structure. The topic of conversation since chapter 18 is what we've been calling the innate love that every single Jewish person has a naturally default settings. We have a very strong love for God.
Good expression, good association.
What was the expression?
Default.
In our
It's a common
default
term
settings.
we use these
And,
days.
the reason why it's so important, the reason how this came up in our discussion is because the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us how is it possible to say that it's very close. It's very, I don't want to say the word easy, but it's very close to us to love and fear God. And we gave one answer, which is based on a lot of meditation, a lot of what we've called emotional, intellectual emotion. But the Alter Rebbe, conceded that that's not easy. Is it possible? Yes. Did he give us a clear path to do it? Yes. But it's still a lifetime of work. So what is the easy way? If we were to imagine that there's a long, short way and a short, long way, right? There's the right over the mountain. You're there in a couple of minutes. It's easy. It has its downsides, as we'll discuss. But it's much closer to you. You're right there. The short, long way, the way of taking the highway, even if it circles around a couple of mountains, it's very smooth, it's very consistent, and you'll get there eventually, but you'll get there in a smooth and consistent way. This is a much shorter, easier in certain ways way of doing it, and that is to tap in to this default love that we have for God. Now, we spent a couple of chapters discussing where exactly that love is and how that love is in our soul. It comes included as an inheritance from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, that is just part of who we are. The same way some people inherit from their parents an eye color or a hair color, we inherit from our foreparents a relationship, a love for God. What is that? Where does that love pop up? And so generally speaking, the one place where you can rely on that love to be a part of your life is when it becomes all or nothing. In an emergency situation where someone is faced with a choice, are you in or are you out? Either serve an idol or I'll kill you. This default love springs into action and we feel it, and that strong love is why Jews throughout history, no matter their background or the level of education, have been able to say, I am Jewish, no matter what you try to say to me. Now, the Alter Rebbe then started to discuss, that's wonderful, but I sincerely hope that none of us ever come to such a situation, right? It's not enough to have a love that comes at an emergency, in case of emergency, break glass and you'll have it. How do we incorporate that in our everyday life? And so the Alter Rebbe said a statement that we then continue to explain, which was that every single mitzvah, every single positive mitzvah is an expression of the commandment to believe in only one God. And every single sin is an expression of idol worship. And that's all we have to do. If we can internalize that, then when I'm faced with a decision, do I sin or not? No matter what the sin is, the sin could be, do I put on a piece of shatnez, a piece of a garment that's a mixture of wool and linen that, a very, we don't rank mitzvahs, but a very low tier, low stakes mitzvah for the most part. Or if it's actual idol worship, I will have the same reaction, which is a repulsion, which is an expression of my love of God. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, right?
We had this last night in our Torah class.
Yeah, this is these themes.
To sacrifice our life. If they said, either worship this idol or we will kill you.
Mm-hmm. These themes are very prominent.
The Jew says, okay, do what you've got to do.
Yeah. And where does that come from? And so, Gersha, that's an incredible idea. But again, hopefully none of us are ever faced with that choice, right? We live in a free country where we have the freedom to do what we want. No one's approaching us with a gun, or I should say no one legitimate is approaching us with a gun and saying, do or die. That's just not the life we live. And so how do we incorporate that love, that hypothetical possibility that we have into our daily life? And the answer is by understanding how every single mitzvah is an expression of I am the Lord your God, the first of the 10 Commandments, and every single sin, every single avera, is actually an expression of do not worship idols. And that's a statement the Alter Rebbe said, and in order to explain it, he started telling us about the reality of the world. And these are some of the most fundamental ideas of Hasidic philosophy, and that is the understanding that everything is God. Now, I look around the table, and I see tables and chairs and people and bookshelves, and I see a lot of things that aren't God, right? Especially now we're in a synagogue, so at least everything feels godly. You walk out to downtown, this is all God? This is all... And the answer is yes. Everything, and as we explained in chapters 20 and 21, how everything is so incorporated into godliness. And from God's perspective, it's all part of Him. Just like from your perspective, every hair on your head is part of who you are. And to you, it makes no difference if there's an extra one or you're missing one. That's just not part of your calculus. It's not part of how you live your life. Right? Here, it's part of you. But it's so nullified to the rest of you. As we gave the example of if you're in a room alone and suddenly you grow an extra hair, are you still alone in the room? Of course you are. But there's a whole other strand of hair. Doesn't make a difference from your perspective. A, it's part of you. And B, it's so nullified, so small compared to you. And as we explained, those 2 points when it comes to God, that why is it like that? Because the entire world, everything that we experience, our entire reality, not just our world, our entire reality comes from God's power of speech. Speech. God spoke and the world came into being. Which means that just like a random word that you said earlier today, right? Just a random hello, goodbye, right? It's nothing compared to you. It has no value. It has power, as we discussed at length, but it has no value. Compare that one word compared to your general power of speech, compared to your power of intellect, compared to your power of emotion. As we go deeper and deeper to you are as a person, one random word has absolutely no value. And as the Alter Rebbe explained, that is true with a person. The downside of the speech when it comes to a person is it's separate from you. As soon as you say those words, it's severed from being part of you. If you want proof of that, say something you regret and try to take it back. There's nothing you can do. Once it was said, it's outside of your control, it's outside of your... With God, that's not possible. From God's perspective, everything... And so in chapter 21, that was sort of expressed as a downside to our parable. We used the parable of speech about God creating the world. Some details line up and some don't. But here, the Alter Rebbe actually goes back on that and says, even when we talk about God's power of speech, there is the fact that there's a severing. Once God says something, there's a separation. But only from our perspective, not from God's perspective. There's a great image. I was trying to find a copy of it to print out, but hopefully you can all imagine what I'm saying. You have 2 people standing and looking at the floor, and on the floor is painted a big letter 6 or 9, right? And people standing on either end of that number. One of them is saying it's clearly a 6. The other one is saying it's clearly a 9. And the caption of the image is, right, maybe you're not disagreeing, you just have a different perspective. A beautiful image. But let's think about that for a second. On a surface level, you have 2 people looking at the same image and they see a completely different thing. But is one of them correct? There has to be, right? Someone painted that on the floor to represent a certain number. Just because I'm looking at the number upside down and that's my perception, that's my reality, doesn't mean that it's true.
I have to tell you that last week or whenever it was we were all together, you mentioned this kind of thing. You mentioned the possibility that what was disturbing you was really not worth being disturbed over because of the things you're just saying right now.
Yes.
Yesterday, we play bridge, and I've never been a fan of the person we play bridge with because he has such a dour, serious look, and it feels uncomfortable. And yet, I remembered what you said. And I sat there and I said, his perspective is that he wants to appear more scholarly. He wants to turn himself into a better thinker. He is doing what he must do. My perspective is not 100% correct. And I had a better time.
There you go.
It was so amazing that I'm locked into that now.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, because that's exactly what we're talking about, right? How from two people can look at the same situation, and
Yes.
depending on whose perspective you look at it. But, and this is where, when we talk about between us, we can have, but from God, the truth is, right? I want to go back to our parable about the number on the floor.
Yeah.
One of them is actually true, right? If I walk into a store and I look at all the price tags upside down, I don't suddenly get a 30% discount, because every 6 looks like a 9, every 9 really looks like a... There is one objective truth, and then there's the way I perceive that. And that is, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain that while it's true that from God's perspective, nothing changed before the world was created, nothing changed after, everything is always the same. From our perspective, of course things are different. In some things we see God, and some things we don't. And this idea of you have two perspectives, one of them has the correct idea, and one of them doesn't. We explained the idea of a well, we had an argument. Is it a one-way mirror or a two-way mirror, right?
What?
But a one-way mirror or a two-way mirror. Right? We had that conversation about which one is the correct. It turns out they're both correct. That you have, if I look into a window and I see someone there, it's very clear who's in charge, right? If I look at the boss's window and I see who's looking out over the factory floor, I know who's in charge. But what if instead of a window, that's a mirror? It's a mirror. I don't see anyone behind it. In fact, if I look there and I try to figure out who's in charge, I'll see myself. Does that mean that I'm in charge? Just because that's who I see? And that is the reality of living in this world. And that's how, even when it comes to God's power of speech, which doesn't truly sever, because everything is really God, the flip side of that is that from our perspective, there is a severance. Once God spoke and the world came into being, from the world's perspective, suddenly godliness isn't clear. Now, how does that happen? How is it possible that God, who is everything and is everyone and is all and nothing and is so all-encompassing, you can't even use that word. How is it possible that from there you can get to something that doesn't even recognize God's existence? Something that can look at the world and instead of seeing God, sees world? And that is through the power of contraction, the power of tzimtzum. Where you take the godly energy, godly power, and God himself, only God could do this, funnels it down and makes it smaller and weaker and weaker and weaker and hides it in order that from our perspective we shouldn't see. A great example of this is, if someone is very, owns a lot of property or owns a lot of, someone is wealthy. And they don't want everyone to know exactly what they own. If they want the liability shield, they don't want it to be clear who owns what. What do? They establish shell corporations. So me, as the person in charge, owns a dozen shell corporations, and each one of those corporations owns other companies, and it gets diluted and hidden and obfuscated.
Obfuscated.
Yeah, whatever that word is.
Obfuscated.
Thank you. Yes. Whenever I point at you to say that word, it gets hidden, right? And so therefore, it's possible that wealthy individual can walk into a company that he himself owns and be thrown out of security. Security will throw him out as an intruder. How is that possible? Because it's by design that nobody should know who's in charge. And when that happens, he owns the company, but he walks inside, and security says, sorry, I can't let you in. You don't belong here. That, again, from whose perspective are you looking at? From the owner's perspective, he sees through all the smoke and mirrors, and he knows that, of course, he owns his company. But from the security guard's perspective, they don't see that. And that is exactly how God set up the world. Starting on page 2, chapter 22, that again, we have this parable of God created the world through the power of speech. On page 2, yet the Raksha Torah Dibur Kolashim Bnei Adam, v'nikra b'Torah Dibur Shal Makim Baruchu, M'shem Dibur Mamish K'Dibur Shal Adam. This is sort of starting in the middle of a sentence. Last chapter we spoke at length how when we use the words dibur, speech, regarding God's relationship and creation of the world, it's not exactly perfect. But here the Alter Rebbe says, and yet, even though it's not perfect, the Torah still uses that language, yet the Torah employs human language, and in the Torah, the word of God is actually called speech. like the speech of a human being, which is characterized by separation from the speaker, indicating that, in some ways at least, God's world is also separated from him.
God's word. Okay.
Word, yes, thank you. Why? How is that possible? If everything is God and God is all-encompassing, how is it possible for there to be something separate from God? For in truth, it is so that God's word is separated from him, not indeed with respect to himself, but only with respect to various creations, as will soon be explained, that this separation comes about by way of a descent and flow from the life force to the lower planes. How does that work? How does the one big mogul, the one boss, how does he dilute his presence that even that the employees don't realize that he's the owner? But tzimtzum rabim va'atzumim minim v'minim sheinim lehibaris mehem briim rabim minim sheinim. This descent is accomplished through many powerful contractions, with each successive contraction increasingly veiling the divine life force. And these contractions are of various kinds in order that many diverse creatures may be created through them.
I'm missing all this.
Okay.
David, tell me what he said.
So the idea, David, if you allow, this idea of, what do you see when you look at this table?
A table.
Okay. What if I told you that this table is really God?
I get it.
Not that we, God forbid, serve the table, but this is an expression of godliness because everything is an expression of godliness.
Okay.
Now, we're going to right now be focusing on our perspective. Why don't I see God when I look at this table? If this table is created by God, why don't I see that this is a godly table?
I could give you a lot of answers, but what's the answer?
The answer is that God is hiding himself.
Oh, I didn't have that answer.
God is hiding?
God is hiding himself. God is specifically, that word obfuscating his presence in the world, that even though from his perspective, a godly person, a person who's really in tune, which is not, when I say a godly person, I don't mean someone who's lives a pious life, but someone who's in tune to the godly reality.
This is very cool.
Thank you. I'll let the Alter Rebbe know. This
is totally cool.
Towards the end of his life, the Alter Rebbe, and especially a tzaddik, a holy person, as they get to the end of their life, they're less of this world and more of the next world. And the Alter Rebbe, very close to the end of his life, turned to his son, who was going to later on become the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe of the Chabad dynasty, and asked him, what do you see when you look at that beam? He says, I see a beam. Like, what's the question? He says, you know what I see? I see the Word of God that's powering that beam. Because he was more in the spiritual reality than the physical reality. And so you can be living in a very physical world, intellectually understanding that everything is created by God.
I love the hiding perspective.
God, yeah. And that's the topic of this chapter. Why and how does God hide himself?
Exactly what I'm looking for here.
All right. Because, when we talk about neutral things like tables, that's easy to understand. What about if we talk about wickedness or evil? Or what if we talk about, very simply, we're talking about keeping kosher, non-kosher food? How does God, spirituality, holiness of God, come to create and be non-kosher food? How does that happen? It's such a disconnect.
That sounds interesting.
Hey,
Caught my attention.
come sit down.
The lady in charge of the kitchen and all the food is standing there listening to this kosher.
Yeah. How does that happen?
Good time.
And the answer is that God has to dilute his presence. It is impossible from a logical
Dilute his presence?
dilute.
Okay.
He has to weaken his presence.
Okay.
Right? Just like if you want to hide your ownership of a company, you have to have shell corporations and boards and trustees and so many things to hide your presence in order. But here's the thing. The Alter Rebbe is about to explain that point, that this hiding, this contraction, as we call it, tzimtzum, means contraction. God's contracting his presence is so strong that the world itself doesn't realize where it comes from. Just like the security guard doesn't realize who's really employing him.
Right.
That's what happens as well. Continue on page 3. Indeed, so great and powerful are the contractions and the concealment of the supernal countenance, i.e. the inner, deeper aspect of the divine life force that is so heavily veiled, that even unclean things and klippos and sitra achra can come into being and be created. God is hiding himself so much.
So what is he asking us to how to behave because of that?
That's a great question. I'll reverse that question into the answer.
All right.
The reason why God does that is in order that we should have a choice on how to act.
That's always his case.
Yes, absolutely. But there's a caveat, and we're getting a little bit. We're not going into strict structure of the chapter, which I'm glad about because it's more of a conversation. But what happens is, does God really want the unclean, impure? We use the word impure. Does God really want the impure stuff?
Of course not.
Right? God wants, yes.
Yes and no?
Right?
Right.
That's exactly the challenge.
Right.
It's yes and no. That expression of God, right, and here's where we have to be careful, because as soon as you say God can't or God won't, we're starting living on. Because God could do anything, right? God could have
making choices for him.
Right. But based on the way that God decided to set up the world, God decided that there's going to be two opposing forces. One of them pro-God and one of them anti-God. Now the problem is that God has to create both. And so for the pro-God stuff, that's very easy. God just creates them and he's happy about them and it's amazing. For the anti-God stuff, God has to dilute and hide and contract his presence in order that it's not clear that these were created by God. They come up and say, I'm my own thing. I'm anti-God. And all that is a testament to how good God is at concealing his own presence. This idea of creating things that you don't like in Hasidic and Jewish thing is called like tossing it behind your back, right? You have two ways that you can pay for something. You have to go to City Hall and you have to pay. One of them is to make a donation to a wonderful city project that you're very excited about. So you walk in, you're all excited, and you write out a check, and everything's beautiful. What if you get a fine that you don't think you actually deserved? Now, you're worried about going to prison, so you're going to go in to pay it. But maybe you'll walk in with a wheelbarrow full of pennies, right? Maybe you'll do something to show this is not how I want to pay this. I don't want to pay this. I'm forced to. Yes, life is forcing me to do this, but I don't want to. What is that in this chapter of Tanya? The Alter Rebbe says that's a difference of God doing it from the front side. God with a smile, with his smiling countenance, creates something, creates spiritual holy things. Or does God create it like throwing it behind his back? That is called the backside. The front side is something God has decided to create, wants to create. The backside, God sort of throwing it over his shoulder, he has to do it, but it's reluctantly. He's
Maybe
expressing...
he didn't always have to do it. He only had to do it because.
So that's sort of where, like, that's beyond the scope of this chapter, because that's a whole very important but complicated question.
Well,
but why did
goes
God...
back to Noah and Abraham.
Exactly, and that's sort of a much different twist on this conversation, because, right, we discussed on Tuesday night about how, like, things go backwards, you know. You're going to say, but why? God decided to do it this way. But why did God decide to do it this way? Because he was limited, but God's not limited, so but why? And we're going to stop a few but whys short, because that's a much different question. But the question that we're discussing now is God creates everything. Some things are from a smiling face. He's happy to do it. God creating mitzvos. And some things, God creates... we'll continue on page 3 to find those words. And receive their life and existence from the divine word and the breath of his mouth through the concealment of his countenance and through the downward gradation. That's how God creates it. Now, in our world, most things are hiding God's presence. Either they're neutral, which means, right, neutral is really hiding their reality. Because if everything is godly, this table, it's not anti-God, but is it godly? No, it's a table. It's a physical table that could be used for anything. And that comes from the power of the klippa, the shell. A shell, it covers over what's inside. And so even though everything is godly, everything in this world...
Perhaps other religious choices are a setup.
How so?
Or a setup?
A setup by God.
Yeah.
Hiding.
Absolutely. That, now I understand what you're saying. Absolutely. And that's what we're going to say. That's why God has this whole game that he plays with us. God is
Yeah.
playing hide and seek with us.
That's fantastic.
God wants us. We're saying a lot of stories this week, but the altar, I don't want to say which names it was, but
Good thought.
one of the, I believe it was the third Chabad Rabbi, if I'm getting the name mixed up, hopefully they'll forgive me, was playing hide and seek. He was a child and he was playing hide and seek with his cousins. And he comes crying, I think I'm getting the names wrong, but he comes crying to his grandfather. And so what happened? He says, well, I was playing hide and seek with my friends, my cousins, and my hiding spot was so good that eventually just gave up and went home. So I'm sitting there waiting to be found and no one's even looking for me. And so his grandfather, or father, whoever it was, comforted him and smiled. He says, listen, I have some news for you. You and God have the exact same problem. God hid himself within the world. He's playing hide and seek with us. He wants us to come find him,
But it was
but we gave up.
too difficult.
It was too difficult. He did such a good job that we gave up.
It's a good story.
And that's our
He doesn't
job.
want us to give up, though.
He doesn't want us to give up. And so the same way this child was crying, my friends gave up, I'm hiding, I'm so proud of my good hiding spot. My friends gave up and stopped looking for me. That's exactly what God's going through as well. We have to go there. He's still waiting in every moment and every opportunity. Even though we don't see God, God is hiding himself. It's an opportunity to connect him. Now, some things are an opportunity. A table is an opportunity to use for a good purpose, and that's how you connect God to it. Some things, pork, there's no opportunity to use it out for a positive way. What's the opportunity waiting there? To avoid it. Right? Some things in our life are there for us to utilize, and some things are there in our life, are part of our life, in order that we should be able to avoid it. But all of these are God hiding himself. God, in order for there to be a fair world and a game of hide and seek, God has to hide himself. But all of these obstacles, all of these contractions, God is creating reluctantly. Bechinas acharayim, throwing it over his shoulder. And the Alter Rebbe connects that word acharayim, behind my back, backside, reluctantly, back of the head, connects it to a word within the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not have Elokim acherim, other gods. The word other gods, Elokim acherim, can also be read as gods that come from acharayim, acharayim, that come from
That's
them.
what I said.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the last paragraph on page 3. V'lachei nikreim Elokim acherim v'nei shenikasem v'chayusam ein b'chilas panim elam b'chilas acharayim d'kedusha. For this reason, the klipos, right? The klipos are that general force that hides God's. Is that chapter? Yeah, that is. We're on the bottom of page 3. The klipos are that general force that hides God's presence. They are called other gods for their nature and vitality, which they draw the realm of holiness, since every existing being draws its life force from holiness, does not derive from the countenance, i.e. the inner aspect of the divine will, but from the acharayim, the hinder parts of holiness, i.e. the external, superficial aspect of the divine will. And by the way, spoiler alert, this is how we're going to explain that anything that rejects God's presence is in some aspect idol worship.
The God.
The God, right? Capital G.
And capital T.
Yes, exactly. Capital T, capital G. The God. Anything that rejects God's presence is idol worship to a certain extent.
Lest we forget.
As we,
We forget.
At the same time, how and when do we discuss the need for trade?
right now, in a couple of lines.
Okay.
Continue on page 4. Perish acharayim. Ka'adam anishin davar l'shenish l'beratzayin shemamshich lei kalacher kaspay ksefay ki machshir panav mimeno mi sinasei eisei. The meaning of the hinder part, this is what we explained outside, so we'll just read it inside quickly, is exemplified in the act of a person who gives something unwillingly to his enemy with an ulterior motive. He throws the object over his shoulder when he turns his face away from him out of his hatred for him. Right? I don't want to give it, I have to. I don't want to avoid prison time, or I want to avoid whatever the consequence is going to be. So you throw it over your shoulder, backhanded, you deliver your fine in a wheelbarrow full of pennies. That same idea exists by God. God can create with two different ways. He can create with a shining face. I'm happy to do this. or we can create with reluctance. V'chein l'mayla, b'chinas panim hu pnimius haratzon elyon v'chaftzei amiti asher chafetz Hashem lashpiach chayis v'chol ha'kerev elav misitru d'kedusha. So too on high, the term countenance, God's smiling face, represents the inner quality of the supernal will and its true desire, namely the desire of God to dispense life to all who belong to the realm of holiness, who are close to Him. You can hand your child some money that they need for school in two different ways. One of them is because they won a prize, and so they earned a class trip, and so you have to give them the $20 so they can go on the trip that they earned. And you're so happy to do it. This is an expression of nachas. What nachas? Your child did so well, with a big smile. If that same child messes up and they broke something in the school, so now they have to pay $20 to get it fixed, you're handing them the same $20, but it's a very different look on your face. And that's exactly what's happening here. One of them is the inner desire. God really wants to do this. God's true desire, what we're going to call his inner desire, is to dispense goodness and holiness to everyone who wants to connect with him.
How long did it take Chabad to become a force or an option for these Jews before Chabad?
So the early history of Chabad the Chabad as we understand it today is barely, I'd say, 75 years old.
Very young.
Very young, relatively speaking, because Chabad as a movement is 250 years old.
Okay.
But the movement that existed in Eastern Europe and Russia especially was a very different movement to what the previous Rabbi started in 1940 when he came to America, and especially the Rabbi ramped up in 1950, 1951 to become this global powerhouse of giving everyone the opportunity. This Tanya was printed. Every time we print the copies, it has a short biography of the Tanya. The Tanya was originally printed in. It actually doesn't say the exact year. The Tanya was printed in the late 1700s, early 1800s, but it was very often a closed book, right? It was but when you know something good and you love your fellow Jew, you can't help but share it, and that's what Chabad has become more recently. But these ideas of
that we're embracing.
Yes, that we're embracing. What is this idea that we're talking about in this chapter? That God created everything.
Yeah, right.
Something he created with a smiling face that he maintains a connection with. And some things, in fact, most things in this world, God created reluctantly. But then why would God create it?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, why?
So we're going
train us.
to give us the opportunity. We're going to fit the answers at the bottom of
You can't go up and touch him, okay?
Well, what do we have to worry about?
We have to be careful.
Let's finish the page so we can understand this idea. Kach l'mayla. So something God is proudly, happily creating. Take $20 to go on the trip that you earned. This is what I really want. I want to connect with you. I want to give holiness and goodness to everyone who connects with me. Avol sitra achra v'tuma. But sitra achra, the word sitra achra means the other side. There's a side of godliness, and then there's the other
I
side.
have to go. I wish I could say thank you.
I'll try to speak very, very loud so you can hear me as much as possible.
It's so interesting. I love it.
Just
I
don't
wish
cook
it-
any pork today,
No,
because we discussed that.
No, it doesn't exist in our kitchen.
Yes. And so too, unholiness is an abomination before God, which he hates. God hates it. God hates unholiness. And who created unholiness?
He did.
God. He does not give it life in the manner, live a life from his inner will and true desire, as if he delighted in it, heaven forbid. But in the matter of one who unwillingly throws something over his shoulder to his enemy, this he does not out of his inner will. So then why does God do it? If God hates wickedness so much and he doesn't want anything to do with it, why does he create it? Here's the words that Joy's been waiting for this entire class.
I'm anxious.
But merely to punish the wicked who subjugate themselves to the klippas and derive their power from them, and to grant a rich reward to the righteous who subdue the sitra achra. Why did God create non-kosher food? Why?
To give us freedom of choice.
To give us freedom of choice. That way, our actions have consequences. Because we had a legitimate choice. I could have reached for the non-kosher thing,
Is that where fear, love and fear? I've never felt any fear.
This is exactly what we're going to be talking about. This chapter, the next chapter, and the chapter after that, where the Alter Rebbe finishes this building this structure that he's been building. That if everything is a binary choice, it doesn't matter if that binary choice is serve an idol or not, or if the binary choice is eat kosher or not, wear shatnez or not. See, no matter what the decision is, we have to boil it down to the binary choice, God or not. And that's how, even if it's a seemingly small decision, not a life-altering serve idols type of decision, but a very small decision, how do I make my inner default love of God affect that decision? By realizing that it's a binary God or not decision. Because yes, there is ungodly things in this world. Where do they really come from? God. But how does God create it? Not with a shining face, but with the backside. Continuing on page 5, this is called the hinder part of the supernal will. Now, this difference of how God gives it is not just a semantical difference, right? In our example of how you pay the $20, in both cases, the person receives the money and they know where it came from, and it's just a difference in your feelings towards it. But when we're talking about God, the difference between if it's coming from God's inner desire, this is really what God's want, or God's external desire, he doesn't really want this, but as part of his plan, he has to do it, is how strongly is God's presence felt in the final product. Something that God creates because he's happy to create it can feel that love in the relationship, can feel that presence of God. But something that God creates because, I'm going to use some words here, because he's forced to. Because that's just part of his plan.
God can't be forced.
Exactly, and that's why I gave I gave that preface that the words...
You cannot say that.
I can't say that, but God is... The things that God creates because he's forcing himself to create. Does that work for you? Excellent. The things that God's creating because he wants to can feel that. It's from God's inner will. They can feel that love. The things that God is creating because he's forcing himself to create it, those don't have that internal connection. And therefore, even though they are being created by God, they don't feel God's presence. And that's how it's possible to have a world that doesn't recognize its own creator. Right? In our example from the beginning of the class, can you have an employee who doesn't recognize who the boss really is? Because there's no strong connection. The boss never shows up. Right? The boss is not invested in this company emotionally. The boss doesn't want to have anything to do with this company for whatever reason. And that's exactly how our world, even though it's created by God, it's one with God, everything is really God. Then why don't we feel it? Because God created it in a way that we don't feel it. God created it with his external will. It's not what he really wants to do. Right? There's a very big difference of volunteering and going to a job that you don't want to do. Right? Even if you get paid. Doing a job that you love, a cause you believe in, a job and doing a job that you don't want to do, you just need the outcome. You need the money that's going to come at the end of that day. What's the difference? One of them you're invested in, you're doing it with love. The other one you're doing because you don't want to get fired. And that's the difference when we talk about how God creates holy things and unholy things. Or even, to a certain aspect, neutral things. Because the neutral part of it, the klippah, the covering, is also hiding God's presence. Continuing on page 5. V'hinei ratzin elyon b'mechilas panim hu makar hachayim hamachayas kol ha'elamis. Now the supernal will of the of the quality of countenance, i.e. the inner aspect of God's will, which is directed towards the ultimate object of God's desire, is the source of life which animates all worlds. ולפי שאין השאיר כלל לסטרה אחרא, וגם בכנס אחריים שרצין העליין, ואינה מלובש בשכל ממש, אלא מקיף עליו ממילא. But since it is not bestowed on the sitra achra at all, even the hinder part of the divine will is not actually clothed within it, but merely encompasses it from above. things that are created by God's external desire only connect to God in a very external way. They're powered by God, but you don't feel God. They don't reflect His reality. And therefore, they are compared to not only are they compared, but that is where death comes from.
What?
Death.
D-E-A?
D-E-A-T-H. Death. What is death? Death is an absence of life. On the spiritual side, what is life? God. God is the source of life. God is the power of life. The only way you can have the possibility for an absence of life is when God's presence is not fully there. When God's presence is only there externally. And so too for impurity. For the minute measure of light and life that it derives and absorbs internally from the external aspect of God's holiness is in the state of actual exile within it, as in the concept of exile, the Shekhinah within the Klippos described earlier. This is something we described earlier in chapter. How, if everything is God, let's zoom in for a second. If everything is powered by God, let's focus in on the godly power, the godly light, whatever you want to call it, that's currently existifying a piece of pork. Pork.
Okay.
How do you think that godliness feels? It's very diluted, it's very small, but it's there. Pretty bad. It's an exile within the unholiness. And that's the idea, we discussed this in the past, of as a Jewish person, I don't think we're going to bring it in this chapter, but the Alter Rebbe discusses how, because we are connected with God, we have a godly soul. If we drag our godly soul in the wrong direction, not only are we just doing something bad, but we're taking the godly energy within us and bringing it into the unholiness with us. We're bringing that godliness into exile within us. There's as an example, there's, God forbid, certain people fall into the wrong culture. They can have to be part of the best family, the best community, best everything, and they get involved in whether it's drugs or crime or whatever it is. What happens the moment they do that? Because they're part of such a close-knit family, they're dragging their entire family down with them. And that's what we do every time. We drag God with us into the gutter, into the sewer. Because if God is within us, which He is, we have a godly soul. When we drag our godly soul into the wrong direction, we are dragging God with us.
Godly souls reserved for Jews.
The Tanya is talking about a Jewish person, and therefore, roughly speaking, when we talk about the godly soul in this aspect, we're talking about the Jewish soul.
Noahide
There
soul.
are, yes, absolutely. Everyone has a godly soul on some level. Yes, the Jewish people were chosen to have
At
this.
some level.
Yes.
I've never heard you say that.
This is we can discuss it more as part of our Tuesday night conversation. But the idea of a godly soul here, the way we're talking about it here, is the Jewish soul. Yes. But I want to make it clear that's not to the exclusion. It's not saying that non-Jews don't have any connection to God. Of course, it's just a different conversation, which doesn't happen within the context of Tanya, which is written for the Jewish people. Continuing on page 6. It is for that reason, too, that the Klippa is termed other gods, apart from the reason given above, namely that the Klippa is derived from Acharayim, the hinder parts of God. For it constitutes actual idolatry and a denial of unity of God. For it constitutes actual idolatry and a denial of the unity of God, the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. Right here is where the Alter Rebbe establishes the underlying dynamic of anything which rejects godliness is on some level idol worship.
Yeah, we've said that week after week.
100%. And that's why this is a very slow build-up, where the Alter Rebbe has been repeating these points, that anything which is not recognizing God's presence, it recognizes itself as I am an entity. Now, why does it recognize itself as an entity? Because the godliness is hidden. It recognizes itself as an entity, means it's rejecting God's reality. Because we have those two realities. You have the two people looking down at the number painted on the floor. One sees a 6 and one sees a 9. One of them is rejecting the correct reality, right? There is one true answer to what number was originally printed here. One side knows what it is. The other side is rejecting that and saying, no, from my perspective is a true perspective. And when we're talking about one God, if you're rejecting God's reality and saying, no, I know what's really up, I exist, I am important, I am my own powerhouse, that's idol worship, because you're rejecting godliness. Holiness, godliness, is the inherent knowledge that I am part of God. God is really in charge. An absence of that, thinking that I am really what's important, is a rejection of God. Another word for the rejection of God is idol worship. Continuing on page 7. For inasmuch as the light and the life of the holiness, i.e. the internalized life force in a state of exile within the klippah, it does not surrender itself at all to the holiness of God. Because it doesn't feel God's presence, and therefore it creates its own reality. It creates its own perspective of reality. On the contrary, it soars loftily like an eagle, saying, I am, and there is nothing beside me. I'm the most important. The eagle. The thing about the eagle is that it flies higher than any other bird. The Medrash discusses about how most birds carry their young in their claws. Why? Because it's worried about an eagle swooping down and taking their young. An eagle flies higher. So an eagle can carry its young on its back because no one's flying higher than the eagle. And so what does the eagle say? It looks around and says, I'm the highest one. I'm in charge. I'm top dog. That is what the klippos, because they don't feel God's reality, they don't feel God's presence, so they construe this new perspective of, I'm it. I'm top dog.
The who?
I am top dog. I'm in charge. I'm on top. I'm the most important. I am where it starts and where it ends. Someone who really embodied this idea was Pharaoh. Pharaoh lived in Egypt. Egypt, especially before the invention of pumps and stuff like that, the entire agriculture, entire society revolved around the Nile River. So,
I'm sorry.
the Nile River. The Nile River. Now, there's two ways that you can appreciate that. One is to say, wow, thank you, God, for giving us the Nile River. But that requires an acknowledgement of God's presence. What did Pharaoh say? Or as in the statement to Pharaoh, the river is mine and I have made it myself. Pharaoh fashioned himself as a god. I'm the one who's responsible for the Nile River, completely rejecting the true reality, which is that God created the Nile River.
Maybe jumping in a different direction here. The river is mine and I have made myself. Now, is that I have made it myself, referring to the river, or is Pharaoh going in a different direction, saying I created myself?
So there is that reading of it as well, from a very simple, which is what we're going to keep to in this class. What he's saying is that the idea that the river is mine and I have made it myself.
I think
the translation
has to have the other.
Yeah, there is both, and the fact that I have made myself means that there is no God. They're both an expression. You're correct to see that reading, and they're both an expression of the same point. That I'm in charge. I'm where it starts.
Okay.
There is no God beyond. There is no ultimate truth. My perspective is true, even though it's not really. And that's why you don't have to fashion yourself as an idol in order to have this. That is why the sages of blessed memory said that arrogance is truly tantamount to idolatry. What is arrogance?
Approving more of yourself for that reason.
It's saying, I'm responsible, I'm really good, without recognizing where does it really come from? God. A rejection of God, equal sign, idolatry. Now, do we put people who, people who are arrogant, do we, convict them of the sin of idol worship? Not literally, because there is a different thought process going on, but it's the same faulty logic. It's the same logic of I see my perspective, that I'm a really good painter, but instead of attributing the credit to where it truly belongs and thanking God for my great gift, I say, I'm a pretty cool guy. I know how to paint really well. I'm using that example because I'm a really bad painter, so therefore there's no personal thing. But that's what arrogance is. Arrogance is a rejection of God's perspective. Ki ikar v'sherish avodah zarah hu ma shenechshav l'daber b'fnei atzmai nifred mikdushasei shel makim v'lo kfira b'Hashem legamri. For the essence and root of idolatry is that it's regarded as an independent entity, separate from the holiness of God. Idolatry does not imply an outright denial of God. As soon as remember, from God's perspective, which is the true perspective, everything is really God. So I don't have to reject God himself in order to counter that. All I have to do is say is some things aren't God. Yes, God exists, but this is my department. And that's what we call, as it is stated in the Gemara, that the realm of Klippa call him God of all gods. You don't have to reject God himself to be making a mistake. All you have to say is, yes, he's in theory in charge. He's the most in charge. But there's another perspective here. I also am pretty important. I also am something. Are you something? Gershon, are you something?
That's the realm of
Only if-
exotics.
only if God
that they
says I
can
am.
do that.
You are part of God. If I ask if you are something, I'm nothing. I'm part of God. I'm part of the great, I'm a hair on God's head. Right?
You resemble the table.
Well, the problem is Gershon is, the good thing is that Gershon is able to acknowledge that he's part of God.
Yeah.
As we all should. And by acknowledging that we are all God, we're not saying, yes, God exists, but I'm also here. I'm also important. I'm also a factor. We are not a factor at all.
Does that then parlay into your purpose?
Absolutely. Because I serve no purpose other than to do what God wants from me. Continuing on page 7, Ella, Shagam heim machshivim atzmam liyesh v'davar nifred atzmai ubazeh mafridim es atzmam mikdush shel makim baruch hu me'achar she'ein betelim lo yizbarich. Rather, because they consider themselves to be separate entities and independent beings, and thereby they separate themselves from the holiness of God, and they do not efface themselves before Him. Ki ein kedusha el yein she'er el mashabat lo yizbarich kiniskel el. For the supernal holiness rests only in that which is surrendered to Him, as explained above. I can acknowledge that God exists, but also believe that I'm a factor. There's a great joke that expresses this point.
That I'm a what?
That he's a factor.
That I'm a factor.
Factor, okay.
There's a great joke that expresses this point. There's someone running late to a business meeting. Very, very important meeting. Tons of money on the line. Gershon knows where I'm going. They're circling the block looking for parking. No parking. So I'm running late. Not sure what to do. He says, God, if you give me a parking spot, I'm going to donate $10,000 to charity. I need this business deal. Circling, nothing. Clock's getting closer and closer. At this point, he didn't have to really race in order to make the meeting on time. He says, God, $50,000 to charity. Please, I need a parking spot. Still nothing. He circles back one more time. He says, all right, this is my last thing. He says, God, $100,000. Half the value of the deal. Just give me a parking spot. And sure enough, he turns the corner and there's a car pulling out. He says, God, never mind, I found one. What does that mean? And it's obviously a joke, but the reality of that is, yes, I believe in God. But then when I find the parking spot, whose thing was that? Whose fault? Whose accomplishment was that? My own. And that's when we look at the world as a very binary thing. God or not. Is this godly? Is this surrendered to God's reality or not? Suddenly, it clarifies that everything becomes that binary. So we discussed this much, much earlier in Tanya, when we discussed about, how everything we do is the same idea, right? Every act that I do, drinking a cup of coffee, can either be godly, I'm drinking it for the right reasons because I need energy to give a Tanya class, and that's a godly cup of coffee. Any other reason is not godly, which means it's ungodly. Not that it's wicked, I'm not drinking it for bad, it's kosher, everything is perfect, but I'm drinking because I want to. If it's about me, then it's not about God. And this is what the Tanya is doing over these last couple of chapters, is clarifying and really bringing into focus how everything in the world is a binary decision. Is this about God's perspective, or is this about my perspective? My perspective doesn't have to be an outright rejection of God. It just has to think that I'm an entity on my own. Continuing on page 8, V'lechein yukreim turi depruda b'zer hakadosh. The other side, patent, TM, right? Trademark. That statement, the other side, is also called in the Zohar mountains. For this reason, the Zohar calls the klippos peaks of separation. What is the whole idea of the other side? It's a peak. It holds itself to be haughty, to be a thing, and therefore it's separated. It's separating itself from God's perspective. But this constitutes denial of God's true unity, since His unity implies that all is esteemed as nothing before Him, and that all is utterly nullified before Him and before His will. Which animates them all and which constantly brings them into being out of nothingness. So I want to just summarize what we spoke about in this chapter, because we spoke about a lot of things and a lot of ideas and how God creates the world. And this chapter reminds us that in life there are two perspectives. There is the godly perspective, which what is the godly perspective? That everything is really God. And then there is the klippa, the other side perspective, which is I'm my own entity. Those are the two perspectives. From God's perspective, everything is encompassed, everything is part of God. Everything is godly. From our perspective, from a worldly perspective, we stand separate. Is that clear? Those two perspectives?
I'll buy it for now.
Okay. That's all I ask for you. Those two perspectives, right? Is everything part of God? Is everything godly or not? Is the root of the difference in how we live our life either as a godly life or as an ungodly life?
Well, that's why we have the 3 types of people.
Yeah.
And how you can pull yourself up, maintain.
So I'm glad you're bringing that up, because this is a good reminder that the Sefer Shel Beinanim, which is really what the Tanya is called, the book of the intermediate, the middle person. As soon as you subscribe to the worldly position that I exist equals I'm not living a godly life. So which level am I at? The ungodly level. And that's why really the tzaddik is not part of this conversation. Because the tzaddik we left in chapter 17.
Yeah.
They have their own thing. They have, in our life, in our struggles, in our journeys, we're constantly facing this battle. Which perspective are we going to see? The godly perspective, the true perspective? Or do we keep on getting distracted by our own smoke and mirrors that we see? Yes, who put them there? God. And we discussed at length in this chapter of how God creates the smoke and mirrors and why He creates the smoke and mirrors. But ultimately, it's smoke and mirrors, which leaves us with a choice. Are we going to recognize and live according to the true reality, God's perspective? Or are we going to get stuck in our own perspective and kind of, sort of, maybe we could consider it, serve the idol of our own perspective? And as the Alter Rebbe is going to continue in chapter 23 and 24, explaining how this becomes a decision, how every single mitzvah,
And every single hour in 24.
yes, is an opportunity to connect and choose to be God's perspective. And if suddenly it becomes, everything is an expression of that binary decision, as we will continue to see, God willing, next week.
Yeshak,
Thank you very much.